PRASADA, Micah of the Timberwood, by Niall Piper II. Chapter 1. The Timberwood. In a distant land, on the shores of a large silver pond, the people of the Timberwood lived an isolated life full of meaning and peace. That small group of men and women had lived on those shores for ages. In their quiet solitude, time had passed like rain off a tortoiseshell. That land was filled with the mighty trunks of the timberwood, which not only provided protection from the chaotic world outside their territory, but shelter from the weather that sought to turn the sands of time. The trees themselves were wide enough for the timberfolk to carve out a hollow space that served as their living quarters. Most of the time, depending on the size of the tree, the home consisted of a single room that served as both a kitchen and bedroom. Dwelling in those trees, the timberfolk and their many families had learned to live in harmony with nature. In the time of the second eon, the smallest of the timberfolk was a young boy named Micah. When the night moons were rising overhead and darkness had not yet set upon the treetops, young Micah was busy hunting the sandy shore of Silver Pond for hidden critter killers, locally known as krillers. Furry, circular creatures that burrowed and scavenged for food under the sand. However, if pursued by the timberfolk and caught, the six-legged animals provided a hearty meal when thoroughly cooked over a fire. With steady breath, Micah had caught the first sight of movement in the sand. While the little creature hunted the insects below his feet, Micah waited patiently, with his golden-tipped spear over his shoulder. He kept his feet light upon the sand as he moved across the shore. He waited for the animal to attack its prey and more precisely reveal its location. Under Micah's silent patience, the furry creature made its move, and so too did the boy. He lunged forward and stabbed his spear into grains of glittery sand. Upon attack, the kriller let out a shriek that made Micah smile. "Bachingo!" he shouted with glee. Without a second of hesitation, he lifted his catch from the sand and held it out over the pond. The creature had died instantly. Its tiny gray limbs fell limp at its furry belly. Micah said a prayer to Usapa, the god of the fight and death. He thanked him for the catch and the wealth of the meal to share with his village. As he looked over the creature's impaled body, he saw the overgrown structures in the distance. On the other side of Silver Pond, one of the many ancient structures could be seen between the trees. It appeared to be a giant stone pyramid. From behind the distant limbs, Micah saw there were steps leading up the front of the pyramid to a flattened space at the peak. He thought he could even see a small opening near the top of the stairs. For a moment, he wondered about that mysterious place of the olden days. He wondered what worlds had existed before his own. All he had ever known was the village and woods that surrounded his people. He hoped someday to go on his own pilgrimage, just like his father had done. Someday. But he accepted his place in the village, and he knew his time of travel would come eventually, just not on that day. He also knew that his mother needed him, and so he brought his kill back to the village. With his focus on more immediate matters, he hoped his sizable kriller might impress Malif, his village crush. If he was lucky, she might even glance his way in the kind and teasing way she had done several times before. Her beautiful eyes provided just enough inspiration for Micah to go out and hunt again. However, he had always been too scared to approach her. It felt at times to be an insurmountable task to simply speak with her. Just as he promised himself that he would try, his hands would begin to sweat and shake. He would freeze in place. He felt inadequate and likely to not meet her approval. Yet, beyond his own meandering mind, he had no basis for such discouraging thoughts. With his courage building, he headed back into the tree line and met with the elders who were praying for the night fire to grow from the forest floor. They stood in a semicircle around the dried branches of the timber trees that had been stacked one on top of the other in a small pile. As the elders lifted their hands into the sky, white smoke rose from the broken timber. With the smoke growing, the volume of their melodic chants grew as well. The thick smoke sparked, igniting into fiery explosions of light that caught the long tendrils of smoke aflame, and in turn, the dried branches. A green flame grew far above their heads and whistled a silent tune that mimicked the men's voices. "Come, gather round, young twigs," Mostefus, the town shaman, called to the nearby children. His tattooed lips moved in a very deliberate manner. "Have you heard the story? Do you know how the growing fire of PRASADA came to live here amongst the trees?" "No, shaman, please tell us," one of the children called out from the gathering crowd. As Mostefus made his way closer to the fire, he reached out a hand into the green flame and stroked the fire with his long fingers, weaving it into the picture of a barren land. Micah approached the crowd, making his way to the front. He found his place with the other boys standing near the fire. "Long ago, before any tribes came to be, long before any trees had grown tall, there was an empty land. Gupta fashioned 2 women from the empty space of this land. And Gupta, the god of the sun and above all things that grow from it, was happy to see them dwell in this land, for Gupta was a lonely god. The god above all had only to share its time with the other gods that grew from its eternal fires, the same fires that came from Gupta's breath." The children watched in wonder as the shaman blew green flames from the palm of his hand. Those wildly moving flames formed the image of 2 women above the children's heads. Gupta enjoyed their company, but the other gods were not so kind. Being lower gods, they grew bitter and angry, for they had no flame of their own, no power to devise life. So, Gupta gave them power over this flourishing realm. It hoped that such purpose might quench the insatiable thirst of the gods. Panchi was made the god of stars and sky, Gulda, god of vegetation and empathy, Hutar, god of water, the planets and moons, Mestar, god of freedom and love, and Usapa, god of the fight and death. Still, none of them were worthy of the fire of life. The 2 women, Kupa and Frinar, found their home in the trees that Gulda brought from the earth. They drank from the pools of water Hutar placed at their feet. They marveled at Panchi's brilliant stars in the sky. They shared their freedom and expressed their love as Mestar had intended. And they fought against the elements of the land to avoid the inevitable end, blessed by Usapa. All were happy. The shaman raised his hands above his head and created the image of a large, loving god, looming over the floating women. Gupta wished for its lowliest creatures, men, to prove themselves worthy of such awe. Man has no status as gods, but they live amongst the tallest trees and brightest stars. They live beside the cleanest water that shines with beauty under Gupta's sun. They bear witness to Gupta's benevolent power. Gupta wished for them to reveal themselves worthy, to prove themselves by uniting with one another and placing their faith in Gupta. Micah had heard those stories so many times before, but the tale unfolding in the glowing smoke of the night fire always captivated him. Every young eye watched in wonder as the shaman continued. However, the 2 women, first of their kind, Kupa and Frinar, had no knowledge of the breath of fire that created them. They knew only of the world around them, and they lived in its beauty peacefully. Gupta so enjoyed its creation that it planted the gift of its fiery breath into the land. Yet Kupa and Frinar were unsure of the strange new flames. Thus, Gupta came to the 2 women on a starry night. It told them of the gods, the creation, and itself. It advised them of their place in the world. It demanded that if they should continue to live peacefully in Prasada, they would need to find strength in faith. And if ever they should desire to grow in numbers and grow the land, they would need to nourish their fiery gift. Every night, when the night fire grows, they would need to protect it. They would need to tend to it with worship and song. As long as they always protected the green flame, man would flourish. Gupta would grant them more creatures, just like themselves, and those creatures would reproduce into many. And so, our ancient ancestors, Kupa and Frinar, heeded the call. They would stay amongst the timber and protect their precious gift. Mostefis spun his hands around the night fire, causing it to twirl and spill into the air, breaking off into many smaller depictions of men. He then pushed the little men away from one another. But as the people grew in numbers, they scattered across the land and across the seas. And the further they traveled, the less they cared for the flame they had left behind. Long after Kupa and Frinar, the eternal flame was left for only a few who remained behind. For this reason, Gupta became upset with man. It ended the expansion of Prasada and let the people who fell from its grace become lost and forgetful. The further away they traveled, the more they fell victim to their own mortal desires. Small, crying faces emerged from the green flames as the shaman continued. Thus, left to their own devices, man began to struggle. They grew full of fear, hate, and greed. They fought and quarreled with one another. The other gods wished to end the experience of man, but they looked to Gupta for instruction. Yet Gupta was pleased by the few that remained in the timberwood, the tribe that cared for the flame that brought Gupta such joy. And so, Gupta showed mercy on all of Prasada. It commanded that all the gods continue to provide for the people, as long as a few protected the gift, even if it be but one being alone. As long as one of them should care for the flame that grows in the night, so too shall the gods care for the people and help man grow in beauty and love, grow in harmony with Prasada. As the shaman finished, he swung his hands through the images, causing the little green men to evaporate into the air. "Where did the wayward go?" a child behind Micah asked. Micah turned to see it was Melif. When he saw her, he smiled. However, when she directed her gaze at him, he immediately turned away and stared at his feet. He dared not embarrass himself. Again, Mostefis waved his hands into the green flames, and from the billowing smoke formed an image of warring factions, attacking one another with weapons in the heat of battle. The children watched with wide eyes as a kogadil chirped from a distant, darkened tree branch. "Young twig, they traveled as far beyond these timbers as they could. They desired to explore all of Prasada. But because Gupta had ceased the growth of the land and seas, they came to an impasse. With nowhere left to venture, they settled in their far-off lands and built walls around themselves. They hoarded precious metals and rocks. They fought with one another and altogether forgot their place in Gupta's existence. Many lived in the bountiful beauty of this land without thought or memory of the fire, which you see on display before your very eyes." The shaman then extended a hand into the green flames and watched as it twirled between his fingers. "And you see, children, Gupta remains hopeful that one day all its creations should turn back to the fire of life and grow from it, united once more in its image." With a final stroke, he waved away the displays, and the fire drifted upward in its place. The children whispered amongst themselves as young Micah wondered in awe at the grand scale of it all. He looked up to the moons and wished that someday the people of Prasada would become united again. He hoped he would live to see the day when all learned of the breath of Gupta. The thought led him to wonder about those who had strayed from the path. He considered what life outside of the woods was like. "Have you ever left the village?" Micah asked Mostefis. The shaman studied the young boy before remarking, "I have, and I have seen people without the fire of love in their hearts. I protect this flame, for I have faith that guides our people forward. We are the men and women who keep this world alive. We please the great God of the sun. We keep Prasada for everyone." "I would like to see beyond these woods," Micah responded. "I would like to know what lies out there beyond our village." The other children gasped and snickered as they thought of the young boy traveling on his own. None of the other children had any faith that Micah could manage such a trip. Others had made similar pilgrimages, but it was a journey for tough men, not a wee boy, smallest of all the tribe. The shaman knelt as a few of the others made unkind remarks. The elder placed a hand on his shoulder as the other elders began to sing again. Under the sound of the music and laughing, the shaman said, "And so you shall. But do not let your curiosity lead you astray. If you are to ever leave from here, wish only that those you meet shall be inspired to dwell in the power of those gods that desire good." "I believe I could help bring Prasada together." The shaman smiled and stood up. "I believe anything is possible." One of the other boys, Yuka, took a break from his laughter to chastise the curious young twig. "A fool's errand! You couldn't convince the water to be wet." The others joined in the laughter. Micah's cheeks flushed as he dropped his eyes to his feet. The shaman only nodded at the boy, waiting for him to look up again. When Micah's stare drew to Mostefis, the moons placed themselves around his head like a halo. "All is good, and someday all shall realize." Again, Yuka's voice broke the moment. "Someday everybody will realize Micah couldn't catch a full-grown feetalope. He still hunts for critter killers." The taunt brought chortling again from the others. Shame beset Micah as he thought about the dead kriller in his hands. He felt foolish for believing such a gift might be worthy to win Malif's heart. As he turned to look at her, he found she had already come near him. "You are a good boy, Micah," she whispered, reaching over to hold his hand. "Don't listen to those others. Yuka is an idiot. His mother says he still wets the bed." It made him chuckle. Micah's renewed confidence reminded him of his kill. He lifted the kriller and asked Malif, "Do you want to eat with me?" Malif stared at him with a soft smile. Before she could answer, her girlfriends giggling behind her called her. Upon hearing her name, she withdrew her hand and responded to the question. "I'm sorry, Micah. Not tonight." Then she parted to follow her friends. Micah once again felt discouraged, but considered the gods and the world beyond himself. It made him feel better about his small problems. At that moment he had food, he had family, and he had the night fire. He knew he would be okay for one more night. And so he pulled his father's golden blade from his belt and pierced the critter with it. He hung it out over the flame and sat down by his lonesome. As the other children left, Micah waited for his meal to cook. Chapter 2. A Journey Awaits. The next day, Micah awoke to the smell of oats cooking on his mother's morning fire. Gupta, the great god of the sun, was shining a light through his window, and the sound of the creatures scurrying in the forest met his ears. "Awake, Micah! A new day awaits you," his mother said from the other side of the room. Micah discarded the cloth that kept him warm. He rose to his feet and went to his mother. He hugged her from behind as she stirred the pot that hung by a string over the fire. "Good morning, young one," his mother said with a kind and patient voice. "Good morning, Mama. What shall you do today?" "I want to swim and hunt." She patted his head. "Have you studied your lessons?" "No, not yet." His gaze dropped to the ringed grains below his feet. Well, first you must study. It is important that you know all the world and its wonderful ways. Gupta grows with delight when you grow with the knowledge of its world. He sighed. Yes, Mama. And so he jumped onto his bed and grabbed his lesson book of Gupta's teachings. He sat and reviewed the same chapters he had read so many times before. As he read the passages, he glanced at his mother. She was pouring a bowl of stew next to the flattened bread from the night before. Mama, why must I read the same things so often? Micah asked. I already know what Gupta wishes. I have read its teachings so many times before. She sat the plate on the other side of the table and took a seat with a second bowl in front of her. Come, eat. You must grow. Mama, Micah groaned. You say I must study, and now you say eat. You must do both, she said as she pointed a finger at her boy. Micah jumped from his bed and slumped into his chair. The two folded their hands together above the steamy soup. Gupta, it is through your blessings that we dwell here in your might and grace, his mother prayed. Let us be of service to you and your people. Let us grow and learn in your ways so that we may someday be prepared for the day of unification. Let us be examples for those who stray. Praise Gupta's will be done, Micah said quickly in frustration as he released her hands. He took even less time to begin consuming the bowl of soup. As the first drink slid across his tongue, he gasped in pain at the heat and set the bowl down, coughing and wheezing. What does Gupta teach us about patience? Micah's mother asked calmly. As he gathered his wits and exhaled a puff of steam, he strained to say, It is a road to wisdom. Very good. So, why must you endeavor to consume your stew with all the fury of Usapa? Sorry, Mama. He took a deep breath and blew on the stew. Knowing the trees is to know patience. Knowing the blades of grass is to appreciate persistence. Yes, Mama. She, too, began to blow on her stew and stared across the table at her son. She had kind and loving eyes. We are always growing and always learning. Even at my elder age, I have so much to know, and I have so much I do not know. Remaining steadfast in our teachings is the way to grow in the right direction. Just like the trees that reach for Gupta, we reach for it in all our ways of being. We reach with our hands in praise. We reach with our strength through community. And we reach with our minds through learning. Micah finished her sentence. He knew the line all too well, for his mother often reminded him of it. Besides, when you grow, you learn different lessons from teachings that had at one point felt empty. It is to squeeze nectar from an endlessly juicy fruit. Micah found it hard to believe that there was anything he could possibly have left to know, but he knew better than to argue with his mother. And just then, without warning, Micah's mind strayed. Without a thought for it, and to the surprise of his mother, he asked, Will Father ever come home? His mother set her spoon by her bowl and paused before answering. It was a tricky question to answer, for Micah was so young. As the steam rolled off her soup, she feared that he might find such an answer a difficult one to hear or understand. He has been gone for so many years, Micah complained. When will he come home? Has he forgotten about us? Micah, she began while she reached out to place her hand on his. As she stared into his innocent eyes, she sighed before saying with a strained smirk, Patience. What if something happened to him? His mother's brows caved at the sides of her face. Fear not, Micah. Micah was disappointed by the answer, but knew not to prod her much longer. He instead chose to trust in Gupta and his father. He knew someday he would come home. Micah hoped with great, burning passion that he was correct. He missed him so much. In an attempt to switch his attention, she said, Before you go swimming, I'd like you to clean up around the house and fetch a bucket of water for tonight's meal. Yes, Mama. And thus, after his meal, his lessons, his chores, and his errand, Micah joined the other children at Silver Pond. He stood at the water's edge, watching the others who had already commenced swimming. Their tiny bodies splashed about in the shimmering liquid. It appeared great fun to Micah. He spotted Malif playing with her sisters nearby, and he thought of joining them. With a hint of hope, he stepped into the water. As he did, Yuka spotted the scrawny young boy and took to making fun. "Hey everybody, it's the great adventurer, Mika!" The comment caused Micah to halt in place before the others. All heads had turned their attention to him. Micah took a breath and tried to ignore the mean boy, but Yuka went on. "Why don't you catch another critter killer? Who knows, maybe your girlfriend will join you this time." The other boys laughed mockingly. Micah felt tears welling in his eyes. Still, he swallowed his pride and turned to greet Malif. Unfortunately, she was looking down at the water, clearly avoiding him. She hoped he might not see her embarrassment, but everyone saw Micah's. He fell victim to the pressure. His lips trembled as the tears fell. "He's crying!" one of the other boys mocked. "He thinks he's brave enough to leave the timber! He can't even leave the shore!" Yuka shouted. Micah proved them right. He turned tail and ran far away from there. He desired to be by himself in the isolation of the woods. Sprinting until he thought he was alone, he fell at the foot of a great tree. Micah sat down and leaned against the trunk as a breeze blew past. He raised his knees and pressed his face into the crux of his folded arms. The boy felt beaten beneath the power of his shame. Just as so many times before, he wished those boys were not right. "Why am I so weak?" he whimpered to himself. Just then, a distant humming came to his ears. He peeked up from his arms to locate the jolly voice. With watery eyes, he studied the empty forest to see where the strange tune was coming from. For a second, he thought he saw someone skipping around behind the trees. As he placed a hand on the ground to lift himself and follow the voice, a hand landed on his shoulder, taking him by surprise. He looked up to see Mustafis beside him. "Micah, why are you alone and crying?" the shaman asked. There was sympathy in his voice and care in his eyes. While Micah searched for a lie, the elder studied the young twig. With one last glance at the forest, Micah could no longer hear the singing. The empty woods lost his attention. Instead, he gave it to Mustafis. He could see the shaman already knew the answer to his question. "The other boys make fun of me. It is constant and unforgiving, and I am too weak to stand up against them." The shaman smiled. "Do not let shame into your heart. It is a form of fear, and fear makes you grow in the wrong direction, young twig." "But I fear they are right. They will not stop. How do I make them stop?" "You asked earlier if I had ever left the timber," Mustafis reminded. "Yes," Micah pondered. "Do you want to know what is out beyond here?" "Yes, shaman. I often want to leave and never come back." "Now, don't be hasty." "It is true, though." "Out beyond these woods." The shaman knelt beside the boy and pointed into the endless trees. "There are things of wonder and beauty. I have also found things of a dark and terrible nature. Storms of such magnitude that they could rip the sky from earth. Lands covered with water. I met men of brilliant self-reliance and ambition. Men of great power, ruling over hundreds of thousands. Men of poverty and famine, struggling to survive. There are even men who are no longer men at all. Men transformed under the power of their own misgivings. The worst of people and the best of people." Micah gazed out into the woods and considered what felt like a distant impossibility. Mustafis stood up and raised his hands as he spoke with emphasis. "I found mountains higher than the clouds and valleys so low that no man had ever traversed their bellies. There were seas that carried waves further out than any man has ever traveled. Lands whose ends are waiting to be discovered. Their depths are unknown, and their treasures are yet to be revealed. But the grandest of all treasures." Micah bit his bottom lip as he waited in silence. "The greatest of treasures I brought back was far greater than anything I had ever sought to obtain. A power so magnificent that even the most faithless cannot deny its divinity. What was it? The boy asked, having forgotten his woes altogether. That which you will need to discover for yourself, Micah. There are some things that only you yourself can find. No one else can do it for you. But when you do find it, you will not be mistaken. You will see it is a treasure far more powerful than any other. And with it, you will know you are not weak. You will see your purpose in Gupta's greatness. You will find your place in PRASADA. Micah considered Mostefis to be much braver and wiser than he was, and so he sighed as the shaman reached out his hand. Micah took hold of it. I don't think I'll ever... Micah started. Mostefis interrupted him. Do not have no in your heart. Have only faith. Micah didn't know how such a thing was possible, but he rose to his feet anyway. With another glance to the woods, he asked, Do you think my father found it? You think he also found great treasures? Anything is possible, but some things are unknown for now. Micah paused to think about the shaman's words, but the shaman did not let him ponder long. Come, boy, let us not rot away on unimportant things like thoughts of hidden futures. Let others be as they are. Let them learn their own lessons. You have only your treasures to find. No one else can find them for you, no matter how they might try. You aren't going to tell me what it is that you found, are you? Micah asked as he brushed the dirt from his bottom. Mostefis laughed heartily. And you say you are not wise. He patted the boy on his back. A black crow dashed overhead through the spaces between the leaves. As it made its way through the timber wood and out of their sight, Micah thought of following it. He thought deeply about leaving those woods and venturing out into the world for himself. He wondered what treasures awaited him. As they entered the village, Micah pivoted towards Mostefis. If I should ever leave, who would tend the fire? The shaman chuckled to himself. You are a good soul. Gupta means for us to care for its flame, just as we have for time unending. This is your task just as it is mine, but... He paused to think for a moment. But what? All things in need of doing find a way of being done. I'm not sure what you mean, Micah admitted. In order to care for and protect the fire, you must find you are worthy of such a task. Is that not my purpose? That is not something I can say for you. The shaman stared down at the inquisitive boy. At first, Micah felt insulted by the comment. Are you saying I'm not worthy of the timberfolk's task? I'm not in a position to say either way. Someday you'll understand. Micah sighed, feeling somehow less confident than he had moments before he sat by the tree. Now, run along and enjoy a swim in Silver Pond with the others. Do not let those naysayers cause you any grief. They have their own journeys ahead of them. Micah nodded and headed off toward the water. Before he got far, he stopped and turned back to the shaman. I have heard that you use the fire to see the future. And what of it? Mostefis asked as he rubbed a large circle tattooed across his chest. Have you seen mine? The shaman smiled again. I have. What can you tell me? Nothing. Nothing at all. Micah knew better than to argue with the wisest man in their village. He also knew that the answer might cause him more dismay should it be something unhappy. Before Micah turned away, Mostefis suddenly raised his hand and closed his eyes. The shaman began to shake violently and spoke through trembling lips. I am getting a vision now. You are? Micah stepped toward the elder. His eyes grew wide. Yes, it is you. Me? Micah wasn't sure if he should run for help. He didn't know what to do. Yes, you. You are running away to swim with your friends. Mostefis shouted as he raised his hands above his toga and chased the small boy away with a cheery smile. Micah rolled his eyes as he realized the old man had tricked him. He obliged the chase and ran away. As the boy ran to the swimming hole, the shaman watched him dash out of sight. Mostefis stopped short of the shore. He then gazed up into the trees, where he saw the black crow perched above his head. The bird looked down at him, and the shaman saw his own reflection in its black eyes. He knew exactly what Gupta was telling him, and so he surrendered to it with a smirk. Chapter 3. A Visitor. Micah lay in his bed at the end of the night. Outside, the night fire was waving back and forth in the strengthening winds. As he peered up over his window sill, his mother came to his bedside. "Let us shut this window. There is a storm coming. It will be a strong one," she said as she reached out and pulled the shutters closed. From between the thin planks of wood, Micah could still see the green flame. The elders' shadows reached out across the ground behind them. "Will the elders be okay out there?" the young boy asked. "I would not worry about that, young one," his mother assured him as she ruffled the hair on his head. Micah plopped his head onto his pillow and stared at the ceiling. Thoughts of majestic mountains and massive seas raced through his head. He wished so badly to see the things that existed outside the forest. Mustafa's words would not release him. "Did you have a good day?" his mother asked. "How was your swim and your hunt?" "I only caught one kriller, and the other boys were mean." "Well, I am sorry to hear that. There is always tomorrow. Maybe things will be different tomorrow." "I hope so." "Now, get some sleep. I love you, Micah," she said before leaving his bedside to extinguish the candle on the kitchen table. "Mama?" Micah asked as his mother sat on her own bed. "Yes, my darling boy?" "I hope Father comes home tomorrow." His mother glanced over at her boy. She felt her heart breaking. Someday I'll have to tell him the truth. But she wouldn't do it on that night. "Me too," she said as she laid her head on her pillow. "Me too," she repeated with closed eyes. Hours later, Micah awoke to the sound of the shutters banging themselves against the outside of the tree. Rain was pouring in across his face. He jumped up from his bed and reached out to close the shutters once again, that time with plans to make sure the latch was locked securely. Yet, as he did, he saw that the green flame was no longer burning with a green light. Instead, the flame was a deep purple, and it was larger than he had ever seen it. Micah had never seen the fire glowing with such a vivid color. The shaman and the other elders sat peacefully in their meditative states, despite the furious winds and driving rain. They seemed unfazed by it all. Micah, on the other hand, imagined the winds sweeping him up from his place in the window. Without tolerance to ponder on the absurdity, he closed the shutters and locked the latch, ensuring it was in place so as not to slip free again. He turned to see his mother had not even stirred in her sleep, despite the calamity. Perplexed by this, young Micah watched from his pillow as the purple lights danced across his ceiling. It was such a strangely attractive glow that called to him, as if it were asking him to come outside and embrace the storm. But he knew better. So, he tried to sleep, but his mind wandered to the stories of the shaman. He thought about tall mountains, deep valleys, and thousands of people gathered in battle, and it all seemed so fantastical that he could hardly draw a perfect image of it in his head. Just as his eyes began to grow heavy, something passed in front of the purple light outside his rattling shutters. Something large had just slipped toward the front door. Micah looked over to his slumbering mother. He desired to call out to her, but he feared the thing outside their home might hear him calling. Before he could decide to act, the shadowy figure stepped in front of their shaky wooden door. Micah held his breath as he pulled the covers up against his mouth. He prayed for Gupta's protection, and just as he said the prayer in his head, a brilliant white light exploded from between the planks of the wooden door. Just as soon as the light had blinded him, the door flung open. Micah tried to scream, but his voice was stolen from him. A large glowing orb floated inside the hollowed tree and approached his bed. Micah was petrified by his fear. He hadn't the courage to move. The orb grew closer and closer until his eyes came to adjust. It was then that he could see clearly that the floating light was not an orb at all, but instead an angelic being. Like men, it had 2 arms, 2 legs, and a head full of beautiful ivory hair. The fear flooded from him, and Micah felt an instant peace overtake him. "Micah," a calm, feminine voice called quietly. The young boy's eyes were wide with amazement. He had never seen such a being in all his life. He had never even heard of such a miracle. It was all so unbelievable that for a moment he thought perhaps he was still sleeping. He pinched himself to check for sure. He was awake. "Micah, calm yourself. I mean you no harm." The being stretched out its hand. "Do you know who I am?" Micah swallowed and stuttered as he responded. "Gupta?" The vague features of its face smiled at the response before speaking. "No, silly boy. I am Gupta's servant. My name is Sari." "Hello?" Micah lowered the sheets from his face. "Sorry. I do come with a message for you." "From Gupta? For me?" "Yes. It has a desire for you, a journey that only you can complete." "Me?" "Only you." The being reached out its other hand to brush back the thick black hair upon Micah's head. Its touch filled him with relaxation. "You must leave here tomorrow. You must travel to Golden City and meet the king. It is time for the unification of PRASADA. Gupta wishes for its people to come together again, as one." "Me?" Micah repeated. "Why me?" "Do not ask why. Do not ask any other questions. You have been called for something great, and only you can accomplish this, Micah of the Timber." Micah's eyes searched the room. Somehow his mother was still asleep. Somehow the elders were still outside with the others, sitting peacefully, unaware of the intrusion. Somehow only Micah was interacting with this angelic being. "Do you understand?" Sari asked. "How will I know which way?" "Shh," the angel said to stop him. "You will know the way, as I will help to guide you. I will protect you when you are in need. Have faith, trust. But you must go tomorrow, before the sun begins to sink from its perch in the sky." In an amazed stupor, he responded. "Yes, sorry. I understand. Good luck, Micah. We are counting on you. We shall be by your side." "We?" "Good night, young timber boy. Get some sleep." The angel stroked the boy's face. As their eyes met, Micah fell into a deep sleep, and the storm began to calm.